Hey everybody, welcome back to Retro Modding News, my weekly video where I talk about what's new and upcoming in the world of retro console modding. I missed last week's video, so let's go over the last 2 weeks of retro console modding news. Retro Game Restore is known for making transparent shells for a lot of different consoles. There are some for the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the NES. However, for certain consoles like the Super Nintendo here, you still have to reuse some of the original gray parts, in this case for the Super Nintendo, parts like the cartridge flap up here, as well as the parts that go around the controller ports in the front. Now it seems like Retro Game Restore is working on molds to replace all of the parts for some of these consoles. The first one you see here is for the Super Nintendo. It's likely that they're only going to make these replacement parts to match the transparent shells that they already make, but I think it would be really interesting if they made replacements for the original colors as well. That way, if you have a really gross console like mine is, and you just want to replace some of these parts, like I think some of the controller ports can get really stained and really bad looking. It'd be nice if you could just replace those if you wanted to keep your original console shells. Anyways, it's really awesome to see Retro Game Restore make these for the Super Nintendo, and I hope they make replacements for any of the other consoles that need this stuff. We'll just have to wait and see what Retro Game Restore wants to do with the color for the Super Nintendo pieces here. Zaxor has developed an interesting mod that he's calling the Turbo Nanza, and I'm going to do my best to try to explain what that mod actually is. The Turbo Nanza is an internal RGB, S-Video, composite, and audio amp specifically for the TurboGrafx 16. Now, Zaxor makes it pretty obvious that this mod is definitely not going to be for anyone. If you just want to get RGB output from your TurboGrafx 16, then you're better off just buying something like the spark plug. While that's an external adapter, you don't have to mess with anything on the inside of the console. However, if you want something that might be internal and something that covers RGB and S-Video and composite, then the Turbo Nanza may be for you. On his Ko-Fi page here for the Turbo Nanza, it looks like there's two different options for like an external port that you could use. One is the Sega Genesis Model 2 DIN, although unfortunately you have to use an external adapter if you want to get the S-Video and audio breakout basically from that Sega Genesis Model 2 port. However, there is a Sega Saturn 10-pin version of this, which you wouldn't have to use any breakouts. You could just use kind of standard Sega Saturn cables. I think this mod is a little bit extreme, and not in like the difficulty sense, but the fact that you kind of have to pick which external port that you want to use and then wire it up, I think there's just a lot of room for error there. Anyways, I think an internal RGB amp is a really cool idea for the TurboGrafx 16, and I'm glad that Zaxor has got some experience now working with them. 8-Bit Mods has developed a new version of their MemCard Pro for the PlayStation 1. The updated MemCard Pro no longer uses an FPGA for memory card emulation, but instead uses an ESP32 module instead. The major benefit of using an ESP32 module instead of an FPGA is higher availability and lower cost for them to make this. And because of that, actually, 8-Bit Mods has lowered the cost of these MemCard Pro memory cards from $70 to $50 here in the United States. This new version of the MemCard Pro shouldn't have any feature differences between this version and the FPGA version, with one exception. Because of the lower power of the ESP32 module, this version of the MemCard Pro will work out of the box with the PS2 Slim version, which before you had to do some 7.5 volt mod to get it to work. I think this is a great update to the MemCard Pro, and now I'm wondering if they're going to apply this ESP32 update to the GameCube and PS2 memory cards that are coming in the future. I think they'd probably be able to lower the cost of those as well, which would be a really big win for everyone right now. Ben has opened pre-orders for a mod that they're calling the GameGear HD Video Kit. This GameGear HD Video Kit is an internal HDMI mod for the GameGear that actually fits internally inside of the system. The listing on the website contains two different pictures. The first is the actual HD Video Kit PCB itself, and the second one is an HD socket install kit. Now, there aren't any pictures yet, but I'm pretty sure that you're going to have to drill a hole in the side of your GameGear shell to get this HD kit to come out the side of it. Now, I reached out to Ben and asked what the video output is expected to be for this, and he said it was going to be 640 by 480, and that's 3x scaling. And he said that he was going to work on a 4x scaling mode as well, and maybe up to 800 by 600 resolution too. I think it's a cool idea to use the GameGear itself as the controller for this kind of consolizer, sort of similar to that Game Boy Advance mod from Intech, where you kind of took the Game Boy Advance shell and made it a controller for it. And another really cool thing about this is it should work on any VA0 and VA1 GameGear, regardless of whether or not you have an aftermarket LCD panel for it. However, there is one unfortunate downside to this mod so far, and that is the HDMI cable is not going to have the audio output from the GameGear. You'll still have to use the headphone jack if you want to use audio while you're playing it. Obviously you would, but you'll have to figure out some way of connecting the audio from the headphone jack output either to your capture setup or to your home theater setup. I'm really curious about this mod. I ordered one of these and I'd like to do a quick comparison when I get the GGHD from Gamebox. That's Gamebox's GameGear consolizer. I'm curious which one of these is going to have better output as far as a GameGear consolizer. Last week, Trevor Rudolph teased that there's going to be a version of CubeBoot that will work with the GCLoader, and since I missed last week and fast forward to this week, they've actually released that here on their GitHub. I talked about CubeBoot a little bit in my last video. CubeBoot is sort of an alternate firmware for any GameCube mods that use IPL boot, and now it's supported by GCLoaders as well. One of the cool things about CubeBoot is you can actually bring back the boot animation. If you used any GameCube mods that kind of boot directly into Swiss, it bypasses the GameCube's default boot animation, and that's one of the things you can do with CubeBoot is you can bring back a boot animation and you can customize it too. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have a ton of time to look into this too, so I'm sure there's all sorts of other crazy features. So Trevor, if you're out there or if anybody knows more information about some cool things that you could do with CubeBoot with a GCLoader, feel free, please, to leave them in the comments below. TZMWX has open sourced this SD loader module for the Sega Saturn. Let's take a look at this forum post to learn more. I don't know that much about the Sega Saturn, so sorry if I get some of this stuff wrong, but it looks like this SD loader is some kind of a micro SD card adapter for the Sega Saturn. Now, I think the primary use for this is to back up save games from the Sega Saturn's internal memory onto this card and onto the SD card. It says save, load, Saturn battery backed RAM to from SD card. Oh, that's interesting. So you can kind of load saves onto the Saturn's internal memory. That's interesting. But the other thing it says it does is loads and runs binaries from the SD card connected to the Saturn's second game port. So I'm not really sure what that means. I'm not really aware of that many kind of binaries that are meant to be run on the Sega Saturn. Some people in this thread kind of commented that maybe eventually we'd be able to load games through this Sega Saturn SD loader attachment thing. But as of right now, that's just kind of theoretical stuff and probably not going to happen. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think that one day this SD loader can replace an ODE for the Sega Saturn and you could just load games off of this thing? Let me know in the comments below. Recently, we had a bunch of people showing off some Resin 3D printed stuff. This is Reventlow showing off this kind of controller port for the GameCube that he 3D printed in this clear resin. And this here is what it looks like after it was cured, so it's not as clear when it's actually cured. If you're curious, this was printed on a Prusa SL1S, which is like a $2,000 to $2,500 printer. Then we had more people kind of jumping into this resin printing thing. Avram CE showed off this resin printed shell. This is the Open MVS top shell. Now what you just saw was not 100% size, it was actually 50% scaled. And on the right here, you can see a size comparison with the full version of the shell. But just seeing all these people talking about resin 3D printing, I'm more familiar with like the filament 3D printers, but it just kind of makes me want to buy a resin printer just to mess around with stuff like this. Speaking of people who love to mess around with 3D printing, Greg from Laser Bear is working on these custom GameCube controller port pieces. It looks like the idea is he's designing these to be injection molded, and my first thought was maybe these are only going to be compatible with those Blue Retro controller adapters that he's working on, but it sounds like they're going to work with original hardware as well, which having a high quality source for these GameCube controller ports I think is going to be just awesome for the future. I think it's awesome that Greg is kind of leaning toward the idea of getting some stuff injection molded. There's a ton of retro projects on the internet now that use 3D printed parts, but you know, I think it'd be interesting to see if we can take some of those kind of to the next level, maybe have them be all injection molded so that people can have high quality parts that are going to last for a long time in the future. I know I already talked about Retro Game Restore and their transparent console shells, but it looks like they are working on a Kickstarter for the Genesis Model 2 version of their shell. They've had a Model 1 version for a little while now, but I think it's nice to have an option now to have both of the consoles. In my opinion, the Model 2 is probably the more popular version, even though you could do things like the triple bypass. I guess you could do the triple bypass in both versions of the Genesis, but in my opinion, I just like the look of the Model 2 Genesis better. So if you're interested in pre-orders for the Model 2 Sega Genesis shell, they're up on the Retro Game Restore website now. Now, I have to admit, I didn't do a ton of research into this SD to PSX memory card, but it looks like it's going to be an open source memory card that will work for both the PlayStation 1 as well as the PlayStation 2. And it uses an RP2040, which is the same microcontroller that is used on the Raspberry Pi Pico. video. It sounds like the main goal of this is to make a pretty cheap memory card, and I think it's awesome that it'll work on both PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. There's a little bit more information in the GitHub here, so if this is interesting to you, then head on over to the GitHub so you can learn more. I wanted to do a quick shout out to Jeff Chen, who's released something that they're calling the Famicom expansion switcher. Over here on the GitHub project, you can see that he's referencing his Famicom and Twin Diamond project that he released a year ago or so. These are basically controller adapters for the expansion ports for the original Japanese Famicoms. The Famicoms, if you don't know, the controllers for those Famicoms were actually hardwired to the console, so you couldn't have a wireless controller or anything. You had to just basically use the controllers that were connected to the console. However, it looks like there's a downside to using those expansion controller adapters. Some of the Western games for the NES did not make any reference to the expansion port at all, and then basically the expansion port was unusable by those games. So this Famicom expansion port switcher allows you to switch between an internal and external controller state for those the external plugs there. I don't exactly know if that means they're connected both to the internal controller headers as well as just to the expansion, so you could just kind of toggle back and forth between them. I know I said this is going to be a quick shout out, but whatever. If you want to learn more information about this, you can go and check out the project wiki. And last but not least, Felix is working on a new 3DO HDMI mod. Felix, if you don't know, is the person who created the 3DO ODE that recently came out. If you take a look at this interest survey, it looks like it's going to be HDMI solder-on mod that supports digital sound output via the HDMI, which is nice. It looks like it might only be supported by MADAM or CLIO consoles. I'm not really sure what that means. So this form is basically to check off whether or not you have an Anvil or MADAM CLIO console, because it sounds like that's what they're going to devote their time to, working on one or the other of those types of consoles. And then it asks if you want the upscale feature. Now, I don't know anybody who wouldn't want those, as long as you can get the original unupscaled digital output as well, so you can use it for something like the PixelFX Morph in the future. So if you've got a 3DO and you're interested in an HDMI mod, consider filling out this survey for Felix to figure out what he wants to work on in the future. That's it for this week. If you want to suggest a news story to me, follow me on Twitter or join the Discord. If you want to watch older Retro Money news videos, you can check out this playlist here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.